Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Sitcom video, we're going to be further discussing the PlayStation Vita and PlayStation 4's integration, as well as some new news that Mark Cerny not only served to be the lead architect of the PlayStation 4, but he also served a very similar role inside the development of the PlayStation Vita. This news comes to us quite recently, actually. Previously, his role in such a project had been not exactly hush-hush, but had not been publicised whatsoever. Of course, Mark Cerny was the man directly responsible for the push towards x86 architecture for the PlayStation 4, as well as the supercharged architecture, as he calls it, for the hardware. However, recently there had been some hints that he was involved in Vita development as well. And recently, Yoshida was actually asked about his architecture involvement, Mark Cerny's architecture involvement with the hardware, and he responded by saying yes, he worked on it. I don't think we called him a chief system architect for the Vita, but he was heavily involved in the core development of the Vita. Now, of course, Yoshida himself is the Sony worldwide boss, so he's in certainly a good position to speak. And then around a week later, Mark Cerny himself was available for an interview, and he said he indeed did have exactly the same role on the PlayStation Vita. Now, obviously, the Vita and PlayStation 4 share a lot of similarities, and not only in terms of philosophy of design, but also the idea of in terms of integration. Both systems were most likely being developed in 2008. We know the PS4 was being developed in 2008 anyway, and a lot of the ideas behind the Vita certainly seeped into PS4 development. Now, way back in 2009, we knew that the PlayStation 4 was that the PlayStation Vita was going to be a very powerful system indeed, and there was already news that they were speaking to various ARM manufacturers. In the end, it came down to the fact that there was a leak that they were actually utilizing the PowerVR SGX 543, and that was going to be a quad-core configuration, which means it was going to be a very powerful system indeed. Now, this means that the final configuration of the Vita turned out to be an ARM Cortex-A9 with a PowerVR processor, and as well as an enhanced Samsung memory manager. Now, this gives you about 12.8 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. That sounds fairly trivial compared to, like, for example, the 176 of, say, the PlayStation 4's, but that actually means you're getting about 4 times what the traditional LPDDR2, which would be the traditional type of memory that would be shipping with regular mobile devices, at least at the launch time window of the PlayStation Vita. We do know that a lot of the development toolchains for the PlayStation Vita also do carry themselves over to the PlayStation 4 as well, meaning there is going to be a hell of a lot of crossover and a lot of, let's go with ease of development. We do know, of course, that Sony are going to be heavily pushing the remote play functions of the Vita as well. I guess you could say that the very nature, the very idea of the supercharged PC architecture, as of course Sony and Mark Cerny himself continue to call the PlayStation 4, I guess you could say that they really originated, and we first got our hands on them on the PlayStation Vita's SoC, which is very similar design philosophy. Now, of course, the PlayStation Vita doesn't have the level of performance, generally speaking, of even the PlayStation 3. It's slightly behind, especially in regards to, let's say, the CPU processing power. And remember, the Vita only has 128 megabytes of video RAM. That's about half of what's inside the PlayStation 3. But also remember that the screen size, which is about 5 inches or so, is also considerably smaller, meaning you can definitely get away with either lower resolution textures, lower resolution generally, and much more besides. It is to say that the PlayStation Vita is a very powerful device for its time. Sure, you're going to get some cross-platform titles that, for example, are going to be running at 30 frames a second, or lower levels of anti-aliasing or whatever, but it's a very powerful device for the period of time that it was released in. And I think it's going to become a lot more essential for people because they've somewhat boycotted the Vita. I mean, I think that's come down to some of the titles maybe haven't been as good as what they hoped. I think some of that has got to do with the fact they've not maybe had as many titles in development, maybe not as many indies as well, but we know that indies are also being pushed heavily towards the PlayStation Vita. Sony really focused on the Vita on the Gamescom conference. That took a whole section of the conference up while I was trying to push the Vita and show, what integration was going to be between that and the PlayStation 4, which I don't really mind. I think it could have some definite uses. It's a pity, of course, you can't play it over the internet, but of course there's that latency factor, and I completely understand that. But still, it's going to be very handy, I think, for people who only have, for example, one main screen in the home, or maybe they just fancy playing on the Vita because of laying on bed or whatever. Who the heck knows what goes on in your own house? But regardless, I think it's going to be very cool. It's very interesting to me that Mark Cerny was so heavily involved in the Vita's development. But I suppose from the design perspective, it makes complete sense. Obviously, his team had started to really heavily, well, him himself rather, has started to very heavily focus on the x86 architecture back in 2007. So obviously, they kind of knew that they wanted a lot of integration between the two devices. It makes sense because, well, let's face it, they want you to buy as many devices as possible, which is completely and utterly understandable. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you found it somewhat interesting, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.